Shabbat Shalom. Are you ready for the word? Go to Exodus 12. And Yahweh spake unto Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, This month shall be unto you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. I wanted to go back to Exodus 12 and reestablish some things for us this morning because I've been getting some questions via Facebook and through YouTube about how do we establish when a new month is, how do we know when Passover is, how do we know when the feast days are, how do we know when a new year begins. And when I got those questions, I went back and looked on YouTube, and though we have talked about it in years past, there's nothing on YouTube. We haven't posted anything to YouTube about it. I don't know if it's on any of our Facebook postings or not, but I thought the best way to deal with it would be just to deal with it again. And so I wanted to go back to the passage that helped me a lot, and I'll talk about how it did later on. But here we see in Exodus 12 the simplicity of this statement: Yahweh said, Yahweh spake. When it comes to establishing a new year, all we need to know is that Yahweh said when to do that. Yahweh said, This month shall be unto you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. The ancient Egyptians said that the new year starts June 21st. Well, we aren't going to go by what they said. And the Romans said to start it in the dead of winter on the first day of a month. They named after a god they had who had two faces, one to see into the future, one to see into the past. His name was Janus. We didn't know any better, so for most of our lives, we just followed what the Romans said. A new month is January and it begins a new year. We just assumed either it doesn't really matter when you say a new year begins, or that it had to be right that it begins in January because that's the way everybody's doing it. And if everybody's doing it, that must be correct. But the fact is, Yahweh said when we should start a new year. And He established that the month that starts a new year is connected to the deliverance of the children of Israel out of Egypt. And all you have to do is to study that, is to realize that transpired during the month when barley was in the Abib stage. Anybody remember what Abib is? My family's here with us in the living room. Anybody remember what Abib is? What the Abib stage of wheat is or barley is?
What spring?
It has gone from liquid into the green state. It's between the green and gold state. It's not quite gold, so it's not mature. You could pluck it in the Abib stage and use it, but it's not fully mature yet. It's still kind of green. So that's correct, Spencer. Thank you very much. So Yahweh said during that month, that's when a new month, that is the first month of a new year. If it didn't matter when a new year was, He wouldn't have said this month shall be. So it matters, and it matters a lot. Without knowing which month starts a new year, we can't know when Yahweh's appointed times are in that year. Passover, unleavened bread, first fruit, Shavuot, Yom Teruah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot. And so in order to know those things, we need to know when a new year begins, which means we need to know when a new month begins. So we have to become diligent about learning something that we were never taught. We have to become diligent about learning something we never knew. Now, for me, I didn't learn about Yahweh's feast and then forsake pagan holidays. For me, I first began to question the presence of bunnies and eggs and sunrise services and mistletoes and Santas and wreaths and weird dates and all of such things as that were being mixed into the celebrations I was partaking of. And when I searched it out, I was appalled at what I found. Every holiday celebrated in the church that had been attached to the birth, the death, the resurrection of my Messiah were holidays that came from the worship of other gods, such as Tammuz, Ishtar, Mithra, and others. The dates for celebrating the Messiah's birth were the exact same dates used to honor the birth of sun gods, December 25th. The dates for memorializing his death, burial, and resurrection were tied to a horrible fertility deity, a Babylonian deity that the Canaanites worshipped. Her name was Ishtar. And with it came things like Lent and Ash Wednesday and Good Friday and Sunday morning resurrections. All of those things go back to this fertility deity. I was shocked that the dates honoring these disgusting gods and the practices associated with honoring them were now being used in the church and trying to be attached to my Messiah. When I found out that Easter is not a biblical word at all, but instead is actually the way we say Ishtar in English, I was sickened by that knowledge. It literally grieved me in my spirit. Ishtar, Easter. So I thought back on all of the years where I had heard Easter Sunday. We are dedicating a Sunday to Easter. Easter eggs. Easter service. Easter sunrise service. We were dedicating things to Ishtar without even knowing that that's what we were doing. It has nothing to do with the Messiah. Well, I knew that Yahweh said, learn not the way of the heathen. And so when I studied these things and found them out, I forsook Christmas and I forsook Easter. And when I studied them and found them out, I want to remind you that I had to do it the hard way. There was no internet. I had to go to the library and dig through cards and find books and check them out, bring them home, read and do more reading and make notes. Sometimes I'd go to the library and literally just pull books off the shelf and sit on the floor between shelves and just read and go through them and make notes about what I was discovering. And let me say this, when I talk about all of that I did, because this took months and months and months to do, I didn't start that study because I was a Grinch who was anti-Christmas and was hoping I could find something to support me not having to celebrate it. I loved Christmas as much as the next man. I loved Easter as much as the next man. I was not anti-Christmas until I found out Christmas is anti-Christ. I was not anti-Easter until I found out about the wicked, evil fertility deity that Easter is meant to honor. Those things it took me months and months to discover, however, in a library, a person can now learn with just a click of a mouse sitting in their living room via the internet. The sad thing is that most people don't want to learn and they don't want to know. Messiah said this, he said that men love darkness rather than light. And because they love darkness rather than light, they won't come to the light. But the point I'm making is that if somebody wants to know how horrible Easter is and how horrible Christmas is and how they have nothing to do with the Messiah, if they can't figure it out with common sense by saying, well, wait a minute, these have nothing to do with him, but just by looking at all the things associated with it, if they can't figure it out that way, all they got to do is do a little bit of studying and they'll discover how horrific they really are. But back to my point. I didn't discover the feast and abandon Christmas and Easter. I discovered the wickedness of Christmas and Easter and forsook them, not knowing anything about the feast. Then when I began to discover Torah, there was a progression I went through which seems to hold true for most everybody who I have talked to that's on this journey. Here's what I mean by progression. The first thing that happened after I forsook Christmas and Easter is I had to come to grips with what Yeshua said in Matthew 5:17. He said, do not think that I came to destroy the law and the prophets. And then I had to come to grips with what he said in Luke 16 when he said it would be easier for heaven and earth to pass than for one jot or tittle to pass from the law. So I had to decide whether I was going to believe what he was saying in Matthew 5 and in Luke 16, or whether I was going to believe every pastor I'd ever had, every Sunday school teacher I'd ever had, every television evangelist I'd ever listened to, every college professor who had ever taught me. I had to decide whether I was going to believe what Yeshua said or what they said. They said the law passed away, that we didn't have to keep it anymore. We was under a new covenant. That stuff didn't apply to us. He said, don't even think that way. Well, I chose to believe Yeshua. Once I believed him, then the first thing I was confronted with that was written in Torah, and I didn't even know to call it Torah. I just called it the Old Testament or the law. But the first thing I was confronted with that was written in Torah was the Sabbath. So I set out to study the Sabbath. I set out to study it because I was certain that the Bible had changed it and that we were to keep Sunday now and not the seventh day. You can imagine my shock, dismay, and even anger as I discovered the Bible didn't change it, but instead it was changed by Constantine and by Roman Catholic popes, and then it was changed to honor sun gods. Thus it's called Sunday. So, again, the progression. Torah is to be kept according to Yeshua. Torah says to keep the seventh day is holy. Men say every day is holy. Torah says the seventh day is holy. Next in the progression became dietary laws. I was certain that those also no longer applied. I was certain that Peter's vision proved that we no longer had to keep the dietary laws. We could eat anything we wanted to. That Yahweh and Yeshua had at least changed the law if they hadn't changed their mind. Well, I was shocked to find out that I had not only been taught wrong about this, I was shocked to find out that I was so gullible that I would believe everything that teachers and preachers and books were telling me. I shouldn't have been so gullible. I should have been able to see the contradiction between what they were saying and what the Bible actually said, because I had a Bible. But I was letting the Bible say what they told me it said instead of reading it and allowing it to say what it actually said. So, a progression. First, I followed Yeshua's instruction to pick Torah up, keep it. Then I forsook Sunday, embraced the Sabbath. Then I had to give up, and gladly gave up, bacon and shrimp and the like. Now, all of that took time. It took time because I was not doing it because somebody told me to do it. It took time because I was studying it out, and as I discovered it, then I would do it. It took months and years, and the journey cost me friends, and it alienated family. So a lot of family members. Not because I was wrong. That's important. It didn't cost me friends and family because I was wrong. It cost me friends and caused family members to be alienated from me because they were not willing to forsake the church doctrine and study their Bibles for themselves. Their attitude was, we don't want to know. We're sure you're wrong, but we're not going to read our Bibles to make sure. Well, somewhere along the journey of Torah instruction, Sabbath keeping, and dietary laws, I also discovered that my Elohim had a name. One name that he had recorded in Torah 6,000, or in Tanakh 6,823 times. I studied that long and hard, and I began to call upon Yahweh, the Elohim of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I learned that the Messiah's name is connected to his, and that his real name is Yeshua. And that his name means Yahweh saves. So all of this is in a progression. Then many years into all of this progression or journey, whatever you want to call it, I began studying Leviticus 23, and I'll never forget the confusion I had when I read Leviticus 23 for the first time, seeking to understand it. I'd read it many times before, but when you're not seeking to understand it, it doesn't really matter what it says. But when you're seeking to understand it for the first time, I remember looking at it and wondering if it would ever make any sense to me. The language was foreign to me. You know, it'd say things like the 14th day of the first month, Yahweh's Passover, 15th day, unleavened bread. Then it said something about first fruits being observed on the day after the Sabbath when you waved the sheaf offering. That made no sense to me. And then it talked about the day after you wave, on the day you do wave the sheaf offering, to begin to count 50 days. And then it talked about Yom Teruah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot. And all of that was foreign to me. I'd never been taught about any of it. It made no sense. So I set out to study it, line upon line, precept upon precept, here a little, there a little. Slowly it began to make sense, and eventually I began to see the power, the beauty, and precision of all of these feasts. Every one of them are a revelation about the work of the Messiah, what He has done and what He will do. Christmas and Easter are revelations about Mithra and about Ishtar. But the feast are revelations about Yeshua. So I began to embrace them and to desire to keep them. I was thrilled to be free from pagan feasts. And as I was let me say it this way. I was excited to start to keep the feast, but the issue became, okay, when do I do that? So all I would have to do to get started was figure out what Torah meant when it said the 14th day of the first month, or what it meant when it said the 15th day of the first month. I knew it wasn't January. So when is it? So I thought, somebody's got to know. Who would know? Oh, the Jews would know. So all I got to do now is look at a Jewish calendar and I can figure this out. So I turned to the Jewish calendar. The proper name of that calendar is the Hillel 2 calendar. I went there for answers. If you go to the internet and say, okay, when is Passover 2020? It will give you an answer, and more often than not, that answer comes from the Hillel 2 calendar, or what we call the Jewish calendar. You say, well, when is unleavened bread? When is Yom Teruah? It will give you dates based upon that Jewish calendar. If you look at most of our Gregorian calendars, the calendars we use in America, you'll see little tiny notations about when the feasts take place. And those dates that they pull and put on our calendar, again, come from the Hillel 2 calendar. Well, that's all I knew about, and so that's what I did when I began to seek to keep the feast, was to follow the Jewish calendar. Little did I know at the time that this calendar, which was established 300 and some odd years before the birth of the Messiah, it was created to help the Jews who had been dispersed to keep up with the holy days, but it wasn't created to be exact. It was created with convenience in mind, not accuracy. And so if you follow this calendar, you might celebrate Passover on this day this year. Next year, you're going to celebrate it 10 days earlier. 11 days earlier. Next year, you're going to celebrate it 11 days earlier than that. But then you're backing up into winter. And so what they do is on the third year, they'll leap it forward 30 days. It's all based on math, not upon what Torah says. They'll leap it forward 30 days, and then you start the progression again. 11 days sooner, then 30 days forward. And so when I saw that, I realized that can't be right and that can't be accurate. So that started me on another study excursion. And I have to tell you, studying it out was not what I wanted to do. I wanted to keep the feast. I wanted to keep the feast. I did not want to have to figure out when to do it. I want somebody to tell me when to do it. I don't want to have to figure it out for myself. The Bible says, study to show yourself approved unto Yahweh, a workman who needs not be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. It would be easier if it said, listen to one sermon a week and be approved. But that's not what it says. It would be easier if it said, listen to one YouTube video a week and show yourself approved. But it doesn't. It says, study to show yourself approved unto Yahweh, a workman who needs not be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. Study means use eagerness, speed, and effort to search a thing out. Workman means someone who toils and labors. Ashamed means not embarrassed or put to shame before Yahweh because you didn't care to find out and seek to understand something He told you. He told us we ought to be eager and diligent and toil until we understand what it is that He told us. So I set out to study it. And in my studies, I found out there are several different groups and a lot of different people who want to tell you when you should keep the feast. There are those who follow the Jewish calendar, as I did the first few years. There are those who follow the Karaite Jews, who go by sighted moon. That is, they set the first month of the year based on having the first discovering. Here's the way they set it. The first thing they do is they find barley in the Abib stage. They do nothing until they find that. Once they have found that, then they search for the next new moon, which they will identify by sighting it. So sometimes their celebration of Passover can be 30 to 33 days later than everybody else. And then there are those who follow what's called the Enoch calendar. This calendar is based on a year that has 364 days, and as you can quickly see, there's going to be some difficulties and calculations based on a calendar that has 364 days. Well, in studying this, all of these things, the Hillel 2 calendar, the Karaite Jews, the Enoch folks, when I began to see all of this, I actually became more confused. And after hours and hours of study and research, I could feel a great ball of aggravation and frustration and confusion forming in my brain. And becoming frustrated with it one day, sitting in there studying in that little cubby. I got up from my desk, began to pace, and I went to that door where Amanda's sitting now. I opened that door and just stood there staring out across my yard and across the pond, frustrated, aggravated, confused about how in the world am I supposed to know when to celebrate the feast. And then I heard that still small voice. I was exhausted from my studies, but as I stood at that door, I heard in my spirit these words, just go back to the Word. And I felt all of that garbage that had been piled on top. I felt it lift. I went back to my office. I sat down and I read our text, Exodus 12, and I felt joy. Yahweh said, this month shall be to you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. Yahweh said, and if Yahweh said, then there is a proper time. And I need to rest assured there is a proper time. Any old time's not going to do. He purposely set the beginning of every new year at a specific time, and every feast day is set on a specific date. And that's the reason that the Hebrew word for these feasts is Moedim. Moedim means appointed time. So there is an appointed time for every celebration with Yahweh, which brings me to this. If Yahweh said, and Yahweh set appointed times, that means that He expects for me to study and find out when they are. And if He set them, I can know when they are. So I looked more closely at Exodus 12. And when I did, clarity began to come. I noticed in verse 2 that the words shall be were in italics. That meant they were not in the original text. So verse 2 says, this month unto you, the beginning of months. Not shall be, but unto you. So here's the first thing I saw immediately when I read those two verses again. This is not a declaration of something new. When you insert the word shall be, it sounds like you're establishing something new in the future. But it is not establishing something new. It is a reestablishment of something that had been lost to the children of Israel while they were slaves in Egypt. They'd been there over 400 years, subject to the calendar of the Egyptians. They needed to be reintroduced to Yahweh's calendar. Just like you and I have been subject to a calendar that's been in existence for thousands of years and for our lifetimes. We need the calendar of Yahweh to be reestablished. So Exodus 12 is not the establishment of a new calendar that had never been in existence before. It is Yahweh reestablishing a calendar that had always been in existence from the beginning of time. Yahweh's not declaring something new. He is letting Moses and the children of Israel know that they need to go back to his way of calculating time. He's taking them back to that. So when we hear or see the establishing of a new month based upon a new moon, and that particular new moon being the mark for starting a new year, though it may seem strange to us, we need to understand that it's really the way it should have been from the beginning. What should seem strange to us is to follow a calendar whose days and months are named after pagan gods and pagan rulers who thought they were gods. That ought to seem strange. The children of Israel had been subject to a different calendar and oblivious to Yahweh's holy days. And even if a few had been aware of them, there was nothing they could do about observing them. So look in Exodus 5 for just a minute. It's interesting to note one of the first things Moses and Aaron said to Pharaoh. Exodus 5 verse 1, and afterward Moses and Aaron went in and told Pharaoh, thus saith Yahweh Elohim of Israel, let my people go that they may hold a feast unto me in the wilderness. Yahweh's first command to Pharaoh was, I want you to release my people. What are they being released from? Not only from him and from slavery, but from the confines of Egypt's calendar. That they can know me and my calendar and gather together in a feast with me. And we know these feasts all have appointed time. So Yahweh has to reestablish for them his way of marking time, and he makes that known to Pharaoh. So the first thing I noticed when I reread Exodus 12 was that Yahweh was not declaring something new. He's reestablishing his calendar for his people whose forefathers would have been familiar with it, but those in Egypt were not. I want to take the time to go back to Genesis, if you will, with me please. And we're going to see that that Yahweh has always had a calendar. And before he delivered the children of Israel, he reestablished that calendar. He didn't wait till they got on the other side of the Red Sea. He didn't wait till they were at Mount Sinai. He didn't wait until they had conquered the land of promise and built a temple in Jerusalem. He reestablished the calendar before he led them out. That's the first thing he did. It's important for him and for them to know. It's important to him for them to know that they must follow his calendar. So look in Genesis 7, look in verse 11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were open. When did the flood start? It started on the 17th day of the second month. No one knew how to calculate time based on Yahweh's calendar. Genesis 8 verse 5. And the waters decreased continually until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the first day of the month, were the tops of the mountains seen. Noah knew exactly when he saw a mountaintop. He saw it on the first day of the 10th month. Then Genesis 8:13. It came to pass in the 600th and first year, in the first month, the first day of the month, the waters were dried up from off the earth, and Noah removed the covering of the ark, and looked, and behold, the face of the ground was dry. The water's gone, the face of the ground dry. When did Noah notice that the water was gone? On the first day of the first month. How fitting that Noah looked out on the first day of a new month and the water was gone. First day of the first month. So Noah knew when a new year would begin. And he knew when every month would begin. How did he keep up when months began and when new years began? We're going to see. Genesis 8:14. And in the second month, on the 27th day of the month, was the earth dried. So the rain started on the 17th day of the second month. The water was finally gone, and the earth was totally dry on the 27th day of the second month. There's no ambiguity here. Their calculations were precise. They knew what day and what month and what year it was. Where'd they learn to mark such times? Where'd they learn to keep such a calendar? From Yahweh. He showed them. This information is found in Genesis 1. Go there. Things we've looked at in years past, but we need to refresh our memory on. Yahweh gave markers in Genesis 1 on how to keep time, and he taught Adam, who taught others, how to do this, and they were very skilled at it. They had clear understanding of stars, how they moved through the sky, the moon, how it moved through the sky, the sun, and how it moved through the sky. They knew that all three established days, months, and years. Look in Genesis 1:14. And Elohim said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. The lights in the heavens, or the lights in the sky, serve to divide the day from the night. And he said they're also for signs. A sign is a signal, a flag, or a beacon. The word translated seasons there is the Hebrew word moed, and it means appointment. So the lights in the heavens mark, they divide day from night. They're flags and beacons. They fix appointed times for Yahweh, and they divide things into days, which are the Hebrew word yom, and they divide things into years. Verse 15, let them be for lights in the firmament of heaven to give light upon the earth. And it was so. And Yahweh made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. And Elohim set them in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And Elohim saw that it was good, and the evening and the morning were the fourth day. So we have three markers. The sun rules the day, the moon rules the night, and then there are the stars that govern the years. We were told in verse 14 that they're set up there to govern years. We take those three things for granted and pay little attention to them, but those three things are so magnificent in their power and so magnificent in their precision and in their appearance that they are so precise and so magnificent that Yahweh had to warn people not to worship them. That's how awesome they are. Well, Psalm 104 verse 19 says this, He appointed the moon for seasons. Moeds, appointed times. He appointed the moon for appointed times, or for the feast days. The moon has many functions, but one of its primary functions is to aid mankind by providing markers that make known to us Yahweh's feast days. So by means of the markers that Yahweh gave to us, we can know the proper times to observe His holy days. For those who follow Torah and worship Yahweh, there is a proper time. Those who do not follow Torah, any old time will do. If you tell someone who does not follow Torah that the seventh day is a set-apart day, they say, well, every day is holy. If you tell them the resurrection happened on the 17th day or the 16th day of the month of Abib, you tell them the resurrection happened on the 16th day of the month of Abib, they say, well, we choose to observe it on the first Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox. So any old day will do. But it contradicts what the Bible says. To those who do not follow Torah, there is no concern with proper times. But for those who will follow Torah, worship Yahweh, there are proper times. And there is a proper time to begin the new year, a proper time to observe Passover. How do we establish the proper time? In order to know the proper time to observe Passover or any of the other holy days, we have to know when the first day of the first month is. And in order to know that, we have to look for the markers that Yahweh gave us. And if there are markers, and there are, then why are there so many different opinions about when these appointments take place? I'm going to pause and answer that question before I go on and look at the the markers. I think there is a lot of confusion, and there are a lot of different opinions, because Daniel 7 warned us that about a ruler by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes, who would come and seek to change times and laws. Deuteronomy 7:25. He came with the purpose of eliminating Torah and doing away with every law of Yahweh and doing away with every feast day of Yahweh. He banned them, made them illegal. You could die for even keeping the Sabbath. We know from reading the Maccabees and from history that this was done. And though there was a revolt led by the Maccabees, we should not think that Antiochus is the only one that Satan has ever used to confuse these days. If Yahweh has appointed times He wants to meet with us, then you can know for a surety that Satan is working overtime to keep us confused about when those days will be. He doesn't want us meeting Yahweh at appointed times. He's worked through many to remove understanding of Torah, the concept of times and seasons. So where do we go? Can we go to the Gregorian calendar? We can't go to it for guidance. The names and months are named after pagan gods. Our calendar says the new year begins in January. That can't be right. It has no interest, the Gregorian calendar has no interest in establishing with accuracy the Sabbath or the holy days of Yahweh. Yet Yahweh didn't leave us without instruction. Genesis 1 says there are three markers: sun, moon, stars. It's where I've been trying to get. We're here. We'll go through this quickly and remind ourselves. Sun marks the day. The moon marks the month. The stars mark the year. And we have to follow them from the greater to the lesser. Most of us were taught, I know I was in school, that stars are greater than the sun, or that the stars are greater than the moon, but that's not so. According to Genesis 1, Yahweh set in the heavens two greater lights, the sun and the moon, and the sun is the greater of the lights, and the moon is the lesser of the great lights. And then there are the stars. So the greater is sun, moon, stars, in that order. Therefore, if the sun marks the day, then the day is greater than the month. So you've got the day, the month, the year. So we got to think backward. It's not the year is greater. The day is greater than the month. The month is greater than the year. I think the last time I did that, I used this illustration. An apple is greater than a bushel of apples. And the reason you can say that is because bushel is just a term used to measure an amount of apples gathered together. But without the apple, there is no bushel to measure. So the apple is greater than a bushel. Likewise, a day is greater than a month, because month is just a term used to define a certain amount of days. And a day is greater than a year, because a year is just a term used to define a certain number of days. A calendar, in order to establish the first day of the first month, we have to transform our minds to think like that. A calendar based upon the sun, moons, and stars begins with that understanding. So, in order to learn from them how to calculate time, we have to unlearn some things. So let me go over what we have to unlearn. We have to know there's nothing in Torah that says that a year has to have a certain number of days. We're taught that a year has to have 365 days or 365 and a quarter days. But there is nothing in Torah that says that. If that were the case, then Yahweh could easily establish for us, then I want my holy days to fall on the 14th day, the 15th day, the 17th day, the 67th day, the 265th day, 270th day, and the 275th day. That's not what He did. See? There is nothing in Torah that instructs us that a year has to be a certain number of days. So it should not seem strange to us that Enoch's year had 364 when he observed it at his time. Here's what I mean by that. When you're establishing days by the greater to the lesser, it doesn't matter if it seems it bleeds over and this year seems to have 370 days and the year before that had 360 or 62 days. It doesn't matter. Torah doesn't say a year has to have so many days. The stars do. The stars say that a year is 365 1/4 days long. But which is greater, the sun or the stars? The sun's greater. So the stars tell us about years, but the sun and the moon establish days and months. I hope you understand that. Number two, we have to know there is nothing in Torah that says a month has to have a certain number of days in it. Right. All of our calendars say it does. January, February, March, April, May, June, July. I use my knuckles. That's the way I was taught in school. 31 days, 30 days, 31 days, 30 days, 31 days, 30 days, 31 days, 31 days. And that's the way I knew, except for February, right? It has 29, except every fourth year it has, or it has 28, except for every fourth year it has 29. But there's nothing in Torah that states a month has to have a certain number of days in it. Each month is established by the moon. Now the moon cycle has a little over a 29-day cycle, but there's nothing in Torah that says it must be exactly 29 days or exactly 30 days. Each month is established by a new moon. The Hebrew word for month is kodesh, and it means to rebuild. So when a moon starts rebuilding, you're starting a new month. Therefore, every new moon heralds the rebuilding of every new month. So let's just talk about this year. Well, let's move on. The third thing we have to unlearn. We also have to know there is nothing in Torah that says that you cannot declare a new month unless you found barley in the Abib stage, which is what the Karaites do. The Karaite Jew looks at the barley, and once they have found barley in the Abib stage, then they start looking for a new moon. They won't look for it before. In other words, let's say barley reached the Abib stage on this particular day, and the new moon started 2 days before that. They will not count that day. Even though the barley would be in the Abib stage during that month, they see the barley and they let that tell them when to start looking for the new moon. But there's nothing in Torah that tells us to do that. But that's the reason they will sometimes be 30 to 33 days behind everybody else. Nothing in Torah says that it has to be in the Abib stage before a new month begins. It does have to be in the Abib stage in that month, but not to begin that month. It is a witness that you're in the right month, but it is not the marker to begin that month. Hope that makes sense. We have to unlearn our preconceived ways of thinking. We have to know there's no certain number of days in the year, no certain number of days in a month, and Scripture doesn't tell us that barley has to be in the Abib stage to begin a month, the first month of the year. All right, the stars are markers of years. We're coming to a close. The stars are markers of years. And we know from the stars that the spring or the vernal equinox occurred this year on March 19th. Equinox means that the sun shines directly on the equator and night and day are the same length. Therefore, we say that spring began March 19th. From that day on, the days will become longer than the nights. So the stars mark that for us. You can look at the stars and you can know when that takes place. Here's where new thinking has to kick in. Which is greater, the moon or the stars? The moon. So which is greater, the year or the month? The month, right? Because the moon is going to mark the month for us, the stars are going to mark the years. The moon's greater, the month's greater. So the stars cannot tell us when to start a new year. The stars signal for us that a cycle has begun, but it cannot tell us when to mark the first month of the year. They just tell us that we ought to be aware and we better be on alert because a new year is about to begin. They mark for us when we should start looking toward the moon to discover when the first day of the month of the year will be. You can easily calculate when the spring equinox will fall. It falls every 365 and 1/4 days. So establishing the spring equinox by the stars, you now move on to the next marker, which is the moon. Around the spring equinox, we begin to look for the new moon that will announce the beginning of a new month and consequently the beginning of a new year. The new moon announcing the beginning of the new year took place this year on March 23rd. March 19th, spring equinox. March 23rd was the new moon. Now, here's where some confusion also comes. Some people define new moon different ways. Some people say there is no new moon till I spot the crescent in the sky. When I see the crescent, I know I have a new moon and the month begins based on my sighting. I personally have problems with that, and I've expressed those over the years. I have problems with believing you can't start a month until you see the crescent. Because what if it's cloudy? What if it's raining? How long would you allow it to be delayed before you say, okay, I see it and I'm good with it? There's nowhere in Torah we're told that we have to spot the crescent in order to initiate a new month. It's tradition, not commandment. In my studies, I discovered two phases of the moon. There's the phase where you can actually see the crescent, and then there's a phase called the conjunction. Conjunction, for my definition, to make it simple, a moon goes through its cycles from the crescent, until it disappears and you can no longer see it. When you first see it at crescent, it waxes larger and larger and larger until about the 15th day in, then it's full. From that point on, it begins to wane, and it gets smaller and smaller and smaller until it's ended that cycle. Now it's got to be rebuilt and renewed. Conjunction is that space of time when it's no longer the old moon and it's no longer the new moon. It's finished that cycle. Now, the second it moves out of that conjunction, the split second it moves out of that conjunction, it is starting a new moon, whether I can see it or not. I may not can see it, but it quit being old and it started being new. And that can be calculated and is calculated. You can do that very easily. Mathematicians can do that very easily. It's easy to see that from NASA and from other internet sources. But I am also convinced that if we got out of our sheetrock house and shingled roofs and sat out there and studied it more, that if we paid attention to it, we could also time it. And we would know whether it was when it had gone out of the old and into the new. And we could know a new month had started whether we seen the crescent or not. I quote this as my backup for it. 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 5. David said unto Jonathan, behold, tomorrow is the new moon. Well, how did he know that? He hadn't seen it yet. So how did he know? He had to be basing the new moon or the new month, its beginning, on a conjunction. The sighted moon is not supposed to be the marking of a new month. If the sighting of the moon makes it the marker of a new month, then man becomes the marker. Because you wait on a man to see it and man to mark it. But man's not supposed to mark the beginning of a new month. The moon is. And so as soon as it ends one cycle and starts another, a new month has began. All right. The sun is our third marker. We know this about Yahweh's marking of time. It goes from evening to morning, or dark to light. When the sun sets, it marks the end of a day and the beginning of a new day. I did not start observing the Sabbath at 12:01 a.m. this morning. I did not start observing the Sabbath when the sun came up. I started observing the Sabbath when the sun set last night, because Yahweh said, and the evening and the morning were the first day. So, biblically speaking, a new day does not begin at sunrise. It begins at sunset. We cannot see the sun, yet we know that a new day has begun. So just as sunset marks the beginning of a new day, the lunar conjunction marks the beginning of a new month and a new year. The barley then is just a witness. You cannot begin to look for the new month after you see the barley, or after the barley has entered into the Abib stage. All you have to be able to know is that it will be in the Abib stage during that month. You can begin to look for the new month of the new year when you see the barley about to go into Abib, if you're in Israel. And we said it, I think I talked about this last week. Here in Jackson County where I live, I can know that a new month and a new year is about to begin because my yellow bells start budding or blooming. The daffodils start coming up out of the ground, budding or blooming. I can walk out to my fruit trees and they may not be blooming, but I can see them beginning to bud. All of these things are testifying to me that a new year is beginning. The dead is over and a new year is coming. They're witnesses that a new year is here. So all we have to do from there is mark the new moon, which we did on March 23rd. And all we have to do then is count from there, and we make our appointments with Yahweh. So there are witnesses outside that tell me. I then pay attention to the conjunction of the new moon, and from there I start counting from that new moon. March 23rd I start counting, and I count 14 days, and I know when Passover is going to be. And then the next day is going to be unleavened bread, and the next day is going to be first fruits. And from there I count 50 days, and I know when Shavuot is. And then I pay attention to every new moon that comes after that, and I can know when the 7th month is, and we can observe the feasts that are located there. The month of Abib beginning on March 23rd. We counted 14 days. That brings us to the evening of April the 5th. Passover begins that evening and goes to the next evening. What we do on April the 5th is we do what Messiah and the disciples did. They met together, they had a meal, they partook of communion on that night. That's the beginning of Passover. Then he goes into the garden and he's arrested. The next day he will be crucified. He becomes the lamb slain the next day between the evenings. So that's when we observe Passover before the sun sets. We're still in Abib 14. When the sun set, that begins unleavened bread. And so we are commanded from that day on for 7 days to eat unleavened bread. And so that's what we do until April the 13th. It's the second Sabbath of unleavened bread. And so we keep these days based on the spring equinox, based on the sighting of the new moon, based on the witnesses that are around us. Now, for just reminder's sake, before tomorrow evening, we need to have all of the leaven out of our homes. We get that out. Then from tomorrow night on, we eat 7 days of unleavened bread. From Monday night on, we eat 7 days of unleavened bread, but we'll also, I guess, do that tomorrow night. Tomorrow night is communion. Have communion with your family. Talk about the significance of that. Talk about what took place that night as Yeshua is sharing that time with his disciples. This is my body that's broken for you. This is my blood that's shed for you. Talk about how they sang a psalm and went out into the garden. How he'll be arrested. Then the next night is we have communion in our homes, which is probably the way it should be anyway. Not communion, but Passover. We have Passover in our homes. And we talk about what happened in Exodus 12, Exodus 13, Exodus 14. How the sacrifice that was given was meant to deliver us. Yeshua, the Lamb of Yahweh that takes away the sin of the world. I said a whole lot to simply say that Exodus 12 clarified it for me that there are so many opinions out there and so much information out there, it's easy to get confused. For me, I just simplified it down to just say, okay, well, here's what Yahweh said. He said, pay attention, sun, moon, and stars. And the sun, moon, and stars let me know every year. Somebody else might disagree. We don't have to have a falling out about it. Somebody else might do it a day later or a day before. Somebody else might do it a month later or a month before. But for me, I had to simplify it to, okay, I can pay attention to the witnesses I have here on my farm. I can pay attention to the things that I can see with my own eyes, and I can keep up with the conjunction, and I can keep up with vernal equinoxes, and so I establish it that way. It's an honor to have my children and my grandchildren in the home with me, but I also miss you guys. I talked about a lot of sources that I found to be confusing, but I will tell you about one source that I use that I think has great understanding and that helped me a lot. And that is the Teachings by 119 Ministry on Yahweh's calendar. So if any of you want to do your own research and own study, first thing I would advise you to do is study Genesis and Exodus and see what Yahweh says. But I also think that you would find the studies by 119 Ministries very helpful. I just saw where somebody else said that Zachary Bauer does the same thing in Torah. So he's a great source to go to as well. Yahweh bless you and keep you. Yahweh make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. Yahweh lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. As his name is put upon you, so shall he bless you. Shalom.